Control is an illusion sold to men who are afraid of the dark. They buy it with money and with violence, building walls of glass and steel to keep the shadows out, never realizing the most dangerous ones are already inside. Jinwoo Quan, a man who bought more control than anyone, was learning that lesson in real time. The lesson was currently screaming in the gilded silence of the Vetro private dining room. His rage was a physical thing, a pressure that made the air thick and the crystal glasses tremble. On the polished mahogany table between him and his advisor, Mr. Han, sat the source of his fury, a Celadon porcelain seal, a priceless antique, now marred by a hairline fracture. It wasn't just porcelain, it was a promise, a contract now broken. Explain it again. Kwan's voice was unnervingly soft, a predator's whisper before the strike. Slowly, Mr. Han, a man whose tailored suits cost more than a car, flinched. Sir, the courier swears it was intact. The disruption at the port, it must have been an accident. The message is likely compromised. Kwan's knuckles were white where he gripped the table's edge. He was a man sculpted from disciplined violence, but that discipline was fraying. He was about to shatter the seal, and everyone in the room knew it. That's when the door opened. A girl, barely a woman, stepped inside. Lena. She wore the restaurant's uniform, a crisp white shirt and a long, crimson apron tied neatly at her waist. Her job was simple: clear the untouched appetizer plates, be invisible. But invisibility was impossible in a room with a collapsing star at its center. Her eyes, wide and observant, took in the scene: the terrified advisor, the cracked artifact, and the man radiating pure, unadulterated fury. She moved with a practiced quietness, her focus on the plates, trying to project an aura of harmless servitude. But as Quan raised his hand to finally bring it crashing down on the broken seal, she acted on an instinct she couldn't name. She reached out, her cool, slender fingers brushing against the back of his hand. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a challenge. It was just a touch. The storm stopped. The pressure in the room vanished. Quan froze, his hand hovering over the porcelain. The rage, the seismic, world-ending rage, simply evaporated, leaving a profound and unnerving stillness in its wake. He slowly lowered his arm and turned his head, his dark, piercing eyes finding hers for the first time. He didn't see a waitress. He saw an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. The silence stretched, thick with new tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice no longer a whisper, but a command. You stay. Quan dismissed the trembling Mr. Han with a flick of his wrist. The door clicked shut, sealing Lena in the quiet, dangerous space. She stood frozen, her hand still tingling from the brief contact. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. He didn't look at her, not yet. His attention was fixed on the fractured seal, his gaze analytical, cold. The rage was gone, replaced by an unnerving focus that felt far more menacing. They tell me my temper is a liability, he said, his voice a low murmur, as if thinking aloud. They say it clouds my judgment. He finally lifted his eyes to her. What do you think? She swallowed, her throat dry. This was a test. Everything with men, like him, was a test. I think, she began, her voice steadier than she felt, that anger is just a tool. It depends on who is holding it. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe respect, danced in his eyes. He gestured to the seal. This was a message from the Vipers. A confirmation. Now it's a broken piece of clay. My advisor says the markings on the base are corrupted. Gibberish. Lena's gaze was drawn to the object. She had always seen the world in patterns, in puzzles and codes. It was a strange inheritance from a father she barely remembered, a man who filled notebooks with symbols and algorithms before he disappeared. Her eyes traced the intricate characters carved into the porcelain base, bisected by the jagged crack. Mr. Han was wrong. It wasn't gibberish. It was altered. It's not corrupted, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It's changed. The crack isn't a break. It's a new variable. Quan leaned forward, his interest sharpening. Explain. She stepped closer, drawn by the puzzle, momentarily forgetting the danger. This kind of cipher, it's likely positional. The value of each symbol depends on the one next to it. The crack creates a new border, a new starting and ending point for the sequence. It resets the pattern right here, She pointed a hesitant finger at the flaw. You're not reading it as one line of code anymore. You're reading it as two separate, but related, equations. He stared at her, the silence in the room now charged with intellectual electricity. He had surrounded himself with experts, with violent enforcers and cunning advisors, yet this girl in a waitress apron saw what they had all missed. She saw the hidden order in the chaos. He slid the seal across the table toward her. It was an offering, an invitation, a leash. "Read it," he commanded. And in that moment, Lena understood that she had just traded one low-status job for another, infinitely more perilous one. She was no longer a waitress. She was a key. The power in the room had tilted on its axis. Lena felt it, a tangible shift in the atmosphere. She was no longer the invisible servant. She was the fulcrum on which this man's multi-million-dollar deal now rested. She had a choice. She could feign ignorance, claim it was just a guess, and pray he'd let her scurry back to the anonymity of the kitchen. Or she could lean into the moment, embrace the danger, and negotiate. Fear was a currency, and for the first time in her life, she felt its weight in her pocket. She looked from the seal to his impassive face. "What happens after I read it?" she asked, her voice calm and level. This was the real test. Kwan's lips curved into a semblance of a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze was possessive, like a collector who had just discovered a rare, priceless artifact he had no intention of ever letting go. "You become a very valuable asset," he replied, the words dripping with silken threat. "Assets are protected, and they are kept close." She shook her head, a small, defiant gesture. "I'm not an asset. I'm a person. I have a life." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him. "You had a life. Clearing tables for men who don't see you. Living in a fifth-floor walk-up that smells of boiled cabbage. That is not a life. It is a waiting room. I am offering you the main event." He was right, and that was the most terrifying part. But she wouldn't let him see her fear. She met his gaze, holding it. "I'll help you. I'll decode this. But when it's done, you let me go. I walk out that door. You never see me again, and you erase every memory of my existence. No protection.
No closeness."
I want to be invisible again." His smile faded. He studied her, his head tilted. He was assessing her, weighing her worth against her demand. To him, her request was illogical. Why would anyone choose invisibility over the power and protection he offered? That she did made her even more intriguing. It was a move he hadn't anticipated, and he respected it. "You have courage," he stated, as if observing a scientific fact. "A rare commodity. Very well. Decode the message. When it is done, you may walk away," but the unspoken words hung in the air between them. "If you can." She knew his promise was conditional, as fragile as the porcelain on the table. But it was the only leverage she had. She pulled the seal closer, her mind already working, shutting out the man, the room, the danger. The symbols began to swim, to rearrange themselves in her head, forming chains of logic. And as she focused on the puzzle, she felt his eyes on her, a heavy, constant pressure. He wasn't just watching her work. He was watching her. The predator was studying its new, fascinating prey, learning its habits, its strengths, its weaknesses, before deciding whether to devour it or to keep it. He didn't honor her request.
Of course he didn't.
The moment she had deciphered the first part of the message, a set of coordinates and a date, his promise of freedom evaporated like smoke. His enforcer, a mountain of a man named Minjun with cold, resentful eyes, appeared at the door. He didn't look at Lena as a person, but as an object his boss had inexplicably acquired. "She comes with us," Kwan had said, and it was not a request. Now Lena was in his penthouse, a palace of glass and chrome overlooking the city's glittering sprawl. It was the kind of sterile luxury designed to broadcast power, a place so clean and perfect it felt like no one actually lived there. It was a cage, and she knew it. A beautiful, spacious, terrifyingly secure cage. He had given her a laptop, a burner phone, and access to encrypted databases she didn't know existed. The rest of the cipher on the seal was more complex, a nested sequence that required cross-referencing shipping manifests and financial ledgers. He wanted her to find the name of the traitor in his organization who was colluding with the Vipers. He would sit for hours in a leather armchair across the vast living room, sometimes taking calls in clipped, brutal Korean, other times just watching her. The silence between them was a living entity, filled with unspoken questions and simmering tension. He never touched her again, but she felt the ghost of that first contact, the echo of how she had short-circuited his rage. She wondered if he felt it too. One evening, as she worked, a headache pounding behind her eyes, he spoke. "Why are you not afraid of me?" She didn't look up from the screen. "Who says I'm not?" "Fear makes people loud," he mused. "They beg, they bargain, they cry. Or they become belligerent, trying to pretend they are strong. You are quiet." Still, she finally turned to look at him. The city lights cast him in silhouette, a figure of immense, lonely power. "My father used to say that the loudest dog in the yard is usually the one on the shortest leash," she said softly. "You're not on a leash," his gaze intensified. He was dissecting her, analyzing her words for hidden meanings. This was their strange courtship, a series of verbal chess moves in a locked room. He was trying to understand the source of her composure, and she was trying to build walls high enough to keep him out. "And you?" he asked, his voice a low thrum. "What kind of leash are you on, Lena?" The question hung in the air, personal and sharp. She had no answer for him, only the cold knot of anxiety in her stomach that told her this gilded cage was about to get a lot smaller, and the door was never going to open again. The first sign of trouble was the flicker. The lights in the penthouse dipped for a fraction of a second, a synaptic misfire in the building's nervous system. Lena's head snapped up from a laptop. Kwon was already on his feet, his body coiled with a sudden, lethal tension. He moved to the floor-to-ceiling window, peering down into the street 50 floors below. "They're cutting the power grid to the block," he said, his voice flat and devoid of alarm. It was a statement of fact, not a cry of panic. A deep, muffled thump echoed from the direction of the service entrance. Not an explosion. Something more precise. A breaching charge. Min-jun and two other guards materialized from the side corridors, weapons drawn, their movements economical and practiced. They were a pack of wolves sensing a rival pack at the gate. "Aurelian Syndicate," Min-jun growled, his eyes scanning the room's entry points. The name meant nothing to Lena, but the venom in his tone told her everything she needed to know. This was the shadow organization, the systemic enemy. "They want the seal," Kwon stated, his gaze locking onto Lena. "Or the person who can read it." The implication was a shard of ice in her gut. Suddenly, the air shattered. The reinforced glass of the windows spiderwebbed inward before imploding, spraying the marble floor with a shower of glittering diamonds. Repelling lines dropped into view, and black-clad figures swung into the room, assault rifles spitting suppressed rounds. The sound was a dull, percussive cough, brutally efficient. Kwon moved faster than she thought possible. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her arm and pulling her down behind a thick marble bar. Chunks of plaster and wood exploded from the wall above their heads. The calm, luxurious space had become a kill box. His men returned fire, the roar of their unsuppressed weapons deafening in the enclosed space. Min-jun moved with a savage grace, a whirlwind of controlled violence. But the attackers were disciplined, fanning out, using the minimalist furniture for cover. Kwon pushed her further behind the bar, shielding her body with his own. She could feel the heat of him, the solid wall of his chest against her back. He smelled of expensive cologne and something metallic, like ozone before a storm. In the midst of chaos and gunfire, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of safety. He was her captor, her jailer, but in this moment, he was also her shield. A bullet ricocheted off the marble countertop with a high-pitched scream, inches from her head. He pressed her down further, his arm a band of steel around her. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear. The fight was a blur of motion and noise, a symphony of destruction. And through it all, Lena realized a horrifying truth. The attack wasn't just about the seal. It was about her. She was no longer just a key. She was the prize. The firefight was short and brutally decisive. Kwon's men were good, but they were outnumbered. One of them went down with a wet gasp, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. Min-jun took a round to the shoulder but kept fighting, his face a mask of fury. "We're compromised. We have to move now," he yelled over the gunfire. Kwon didn't hesitate. He pulled Lena toward a section of the wall that looked like a seamless panel of polished wood. He pressed his palm against a specific spot, and a hidden door hissed open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A service corridor. Go, he ordered, pushing her inside. The door slid shut behind them, plunging them into near-total darkness and muffling the sounds of the battle. The air was cool and smelled of concrete and dust. It was a stark contrast to the perfumed luxury of the penthouse. Lena's heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. She couldn't see, couldn't think. There was only the firm grip of his hand on her arm, pulling her forward. They moved quickly, his steps sure and certain in the blackness. He knew this building's secret anatomy, its veins and arteries hidden behind the cosmetic skin. They reached a heavy steel door. He produced a keycard, swiped it, and a small green light blinked on. It led to a service elevator, little more than a rattling metal cage. The space was claustrophobically small. They were pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. The intimacy was jarring, electric. She could feel the hard lines of the weapon tucked into his waistband against her side. The elevator began its descent, the cables groaning in protest. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "To ground," he replied, his voice a low rumble next to her ear.
The garage.
"Minjun will meet us if he can. They'll expect us to take the primary elevators or the stairs. They won't anticipate this. It was a race. A problem to be solved under immense time pressure. Every floor they passed was a risk. Would the attackers find a way to stop the lift? Would they be waiting in the garage? The descent felt agonizingly slow. In the tight, dark space, every sound was magnified. The scrape of the metal cage, the rush of their own breathing. Lena focused on the feeling of his hand, which had moved from her arm to the small of her back, a steady, grounding pressure. It was a gesture of control, but also of reassurance. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The door slid open to the cavernous, echoing silence of a subterranean parking garage. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and cold cement. A black sedan was parked 20 yards away, its engine already running. Minjun was behind the wheel, his face pale, his shoulder bleeding through his jacket. He had made it. As they ran for the car, a new sound cut through the silence. The squeal of tires from the garage entrance. Headlights flooded the space, pinning them in their glare. Two black SUVs screeched to a halt, blocking the exit. Men in tactical gear spilled out, weapons raised. They were trapped. They scrambled into the sedan, doors slamming shut as the first rounds pinged off the armored bodywork. Minjun stomped on the accelerator, not toward the blocked exit, but deeper into the labyrinthine garage, tires screaming in protest. Lena was shoved into the back seat, Quan sliding in beside her, his body a tense shield between her and the window. "There's a freight exit on the sublevel," Minjun grunted, wrenching the wheel to navigate a sharp turn around a concrete pillar. "Connects to the old tunnel system. They won't know about it. They were alive for now. Escaped, but not safe." They drove through the city's underbelly, emerging into a grimy industrial district miles from the gleaming towers of downtown. The safe house was a converted warehouse, anonymous and fortified. Inside, the luxury was gone, replaced by stark, functional utility. Bare concrete walls, tactical gear, and a bank of monitors. While Minjun got his shoulder patched up by another stoic guard, Quan handed Lena a satellite phone and a new laptop. "The attack gives us context," he said, his voice hard. "They didn't just want to stop the message. They wanted to eliminate the reader. That means the betrayal is deeper than we thought." Find it, the pressure was immense, but the chaos of the attack had sharpened Lena's focus. She had the cipher from the seal, the partial data from the penthouse, and now, the crucial variable, the identity of their enemy, the Aurelian Syndicate. She worked for hours, fueled by adrenaline and bitter coffee. The patterns began to emerge from the noise. The syndicate wasn't just colluding with a traitor. They were funding a coup. The payments weren't bribes. They were investments. They were backing someone to overthrow Quan and take over his entire operation, absorbing it into their own faceless empire.
Then she saw it.
A recurring alphanumeric string in the encrypted payment logs. It was meaningless on its own, but it sparked a flicker of memory, distant and painful. She typed the sequence into a private search algorithm, one her father had designed years ago. An image flashed onto the screen, a faded photograph of a man with a kind smile and sad eyes. Her father. Beside him was the name of his last, ill-fated project. Project Aurelian. The syndicate was named after his work. The string of code wasn't random. It was his signature. A legacy key he had created. A chill, colder than any fear she had felt during the attack, washed over her. This wasn't just business. It wasn't just a random crime she'd stumbled into. This was personal. Her father's ghost was in this machine. The final payment confirmation phrase, the one that would trigger the coup, was a line from a lullaby he used to sing to her. The sparrow flies at midnight. She looked up at Quan, her face pale. I know who the traitor is communicating with, she said, her voice hollow. And I know when the takeover is happening. In 2 days. At the Blackwood Museum Gala, the sparrow flies at midnight. The phrase was an omen, a key, and a weapon. Her past, buried and forgotten, had just been weaponized. The Blackwood Museum Gala was a cathedral of modern ambition, all sharp angles, polished concrete, and stark white walls. The city's elite drifted through the cavernous halls like elegant ghosts, their laughter echoing off the multi-million-dollar sculptures. It was the perfect stage for a quiet, surgical assassination of an empire. Lena felt utterly exposed. Quan had replaced her simple waitress uniform with a gown of midnight blue silk that felt like a second skin. Diamonds glittered at her throat, cold and heavy. Beside her, Quan was devastating in a tailored tuxedo, moving through the crowd with the predatory grace of a panther who owned the jungle. To the outside world, they were a striking couple. In reality, they were a two-person infiltration team walking into a trap. The transfer is scheduled for midnight, Lena murmured, her voice low, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they pretended to admire a chaotic metal sculpture. The buyer, the syndicate's contact, will be near the East Terrace. The seller is the traitor. The phrase, the sparrow flies at midnight, will initiate a data transfer from a hidden device. That transfer finalizes the payment and hands over control of your networks. We have a 10-minute window, Quan said, his eyes scanning the room, missing nothing. We intercept the transfer, identify the seller, and neutralize them, their target, based on the partial data Lena had decrypted, was Mr. Han, the slick, older advisor. It made perfect sense. He had access, motive, and was the first to try and misdirect Quan about the broken seal. They spotted him near a champagne fountain, looking nervous. The clock ticked closer to midnight. The museum's main exhibit was a series of large, kinetic sculptures that moved on time tracks, their metal forms sliding and reconfiguring the space. It was called The Machinery of Betrayal. The irony was not lost on Lena. At 11:58 p.m., they made their move. Quan approached Mr. Han, his presence alone enough to make the older man flinch. Lena circled around, cutting off his escape route. Mr. Han. Quan's voice was dangerously pleasant. Enjoying the art? Han's face was slick with sweat. Mr. Quan. I didn't expect to see you. We need to talk about your retirement fund, Quan said, his hand clamping down on Han's shoulder. The one sponsored by Aurelian. Panic flashed in Han's eyes. He knew he was caught. He began to babble, to confess, his words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic stream. It wasn't my idea. He made me. I was just the messenger. He has my family. Lena watched the pathetic display, but something was wrong. Her eyes scanned the crowd, her mind racing. A messenger. A cutout. This was too easy. Her gaze fell on Minjun, Quan's loyal enforcer, standing guard 20 feet away. He was watching them, his expression unreadable. And then she saw it. A tiny detail she had overlooked in the decrypted files. A symbol, a stylized bird wing, etched on the trader's payment account. The same symbol was on Minjun's cufflink, glinting under the gallery lights. The clock on a digital art piece flashed 12 o'clock. Midnight. The sparrow was about to fly. The realization hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. Mr. Han was a pawn, a disposable piece of leverage. The king was still on the board, hiding in plain sight.
Mignon.
The loyal soldier, the trusted enforcer, the ultimate betrayer. As Han continued his blubbering confession, Minjun began to move, his hand drifting casually toward the inside of his jacket. He was preparing to silence Han and eliminate Quan in one clean, public execution. There was no time to explain, no time to warn Quan. Lena had to act. She did the only thing she could think of. She stumbled, her heel catching theatrically on the polished floor, and pitched forward, crashing directly into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. The crash was spectacular. Glass shattered, champagne sprayed, and guests gasped. The carefully constructed social facade of the gala was momentarily broken. The sudden chaos was the perfect diversion. Every eye in the vicinity, including Min Jun's, snapped toward her. In that split second of distraction, Quan understood. He didn't know how he knew, but he saw the flicker of communication in Lena's eyes, the desperate, silent warning. He moved, spinning Han around to use him as a human shield just as Min Jun drew his weapon, a silenced pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. The enforcer's face was no longer stoic. It was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. "You always chose them over me," Min Jun snarled, his voice a low hiss.
Her.
"Any new asset. I built this with you, and you treated me like a dog," he fired. The round thudded into Han's chest. The older man collapsed with a choked gasp. Quan shoved the dying advisor's body at Min Jun and charged, closing the distance before a second shot could be fired. The two men, once brothers in arms, collided in a brutal, silent struggle. They were too skilled for wild punches. It was a deadly dance of grappling, joint locks, and attempted disarms. Lena scrambled back, her mind racing. She looked at the kinetic sculpture, the machinery of betrayal. Its massive steel plates were beginning to move, sliding along their tracks for their midnight reconfiguration. An idea, insane and desperate, formed in her mind. "Quan," she screamed. "The sculpture. The West track." He heard her. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he broke Min Jun's grip and shoved him backward, directly into the path of a 2-ton slab of moving steel. Min Jun's eyes widened in shock as he saw the wall of metal bearing down on him. There was a sickening, final crunch of bone and metal. The sculpture slid calmly into its new position, and Min Jun, the traitor, was gone. A wave of security guards, alerted by the commotion, began to converge on them. The trap had been sprung, but the bait had caught the predator. In the silent, sterile aftermath, the world had been remade. The Aurelian Syndicate's coup had failed, shattered on the marble floor of a museum. Min Jun's betrayal had lanced a poison from Quan's organization, leaving it scarred but purified. The authorities ruled Mr. Han's death a gang-related hit and Min Jun's a tragic accident, a narrative expertly shaped by Quan's lawyers and a few well-placed donations. Lena was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer a key. She stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights spread before her like a carpet of fallen stars. The glass had been replaced, the marble polished, erasing all evidence of the violence, but the memory remained. Quan came to stand beside her. The silence between them was different now. The tension of predator and prey was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of a shared, dangerous history. He had seen her mind, her courage. She had seen his vulnerability, the cracks in his armor of control. "The Syndicate will not forget this," he said. It wasn't a threat, but a statement of fact. A lingering promise of future storms. "They will regroup. They will come again, I know," she replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She wasn't afraid. Fear was a currency she had finally learned how to spend. "You could leave," he offered, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I would honor my promise. I would make you invisible again." "They would never find you." She turned to face him, the breeze from the open balcony door teasing a strand of her hair. She saw him clearly now, not as a monster or a king, but as a man, powerful and flawed, ruling a kingdom of shadows. "And what would you do?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I would be uncalmed." That was his confession. That was his declaration. He needed her not for her skills, but for the stillness she brought to the storm inside him. Her touch on his hand in the restaurant hadn't just stopped his rage. It had centered him in a way he hadn't realized he was adrift. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a diamond ring. He produced a single, intricately crafted key forged from a dark, heavy metal. It was marked with his family's seal. "This is my kingdom," he said, his voice a low vow. "My networks, my accounts, my safe houses. Everything. A queen is supposed to be given a crown, a pretty, useless thing. But I think you would prefer the keys." He held it out to her, offering her not just his world, but control over it. It was the ultimate transfer of power, the ultimate act of trust. Lena looked at the key, then back at his face. She saw her future there, dangerous and uncertain, but her own. She stepped forward and closed her fingers around the key. Her other hand came up to cup his jaw, and she rose on her toes, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was not soft or hesitant. It was a seal, a contract, an acceptance. It was the beginning of their reign. An uneasy victory, with the promise of a shared crown and the certainty of a coming war.